Jaya is amongst the few archaeologists who is actually working on domestic architecture and domestic archaeology, because most archaeologists tend to focus on more spectacular kinds of archaeology. She's also extremely experienced in the archaeology of craft technologies, and I'm sure some of that will come in her presentation today. So with that, over to you, Jaya.
Thank you, Kumkum. And a thank you also to the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library for this opportunity. It's a paper on housing in the South Asian Bronze Age. One thing is that the Bronze Age in South Asia, unlike the Bronze Age in other parts, for example, Mesopotamia or Egypt, is one which can actually only be investigated through material remains. Because it hasn't been deciphered, we really don't know much about this culture or much about this civilization from written records, unlike the other Bronze Age cultures. So archaeology can actually tell us much about various aspects. It's hugely informative. For example, we can figure out about diets, about traded materials, technology, as well as the built environment. But without writing, it can actually, to a lesser extent, tell us about, for example, whether people ate leafy vegetables. Was that part of the diet? So what I am actually going to do is try to locate the Harappan human-built environment in terms of how it was recovered, and also what has been understood of the way 3rd millennium BC communities built and used domestic space. Almost every piece on Harappan architecture notes that cities were often divided into two. One section, a smaller and a much more elevated area, which is separated from a larger and a less elevated section. The actual physical separation must have had a particular meaning. It follows then that a lot of attention was and continues to be paid to the kind of architecture that was limited to the more elevated section, or what is called the citadel mound at settlements like Mohenjodaro, Harappa, and Dholavira. Such architecture is often seen as serving a public purpose, with individual buildings that were perhaps used by a small section of the total population. Much speculation has thus surrounded such public architecture, as their exact nature is not immediately apparent. This is considerably different from other Bronze Age cities in the Near East, where the nature of public built spaces is reasonably clear from the architecture, the associated artifacts, as well as the inscribed record. Much early archaeological attention also focused on public architecture, as these were seen as sites of ritual and/or administration, and in turn were also seen as places places once excavated, which would result in finds of immense aesthetic and exhibitionistic value. Domestic spaces, unfortunately, have not captured the imagination in quite a similar way. The discussion on Harappan housing may appear to be skewed towards the site of Mohenjodaro. The primary reason for this lies in the fact that the site of Mohenjodaro is uniquely positioned due to its remarkable survival to give us in terms a considerable sample of housing units. While no other Harappan site quite compares in terms of recovery, other settlements do provide interesting points of comparison. It would also be useful to compare Mohenjodaro houses with contemporary houses in other Bronze Age milieus such as Mesopotamia. It's not just the physical characteristics of houses that are significant, but what they have meant socially in terms of the use of space or functions, and what insights they can give us into the households that occupied them. It's in fact this latter aspect, the household aspect, that has barely been investigated in the case of the Harappan Bronze Age. So the first section is the domestic space and the household. The household as a concept is a relatively late entrant into the archaeological literature, going back only toward the 1980s. The general understanding of a household is in terms of the members who occupy a shared space, which is usually a house. Thus, at one level, one cannot deny the spatial context of a household, yet the discussion of a household should not be restricted to the house alone. Equating the household with the house is problematic, as it is the activities that define the former. Many of these activities actually take place in spaces that are outside a physical structure or a house. The activities that are usually associated with the household comprise of production, consumption, distribution, reproduction, and transmission. Neither is a household and a family coterminous, in that a household may or may not contain a family, and families may spread over two or more households. Moreover, the family is based on kinship, while the household is usually defined by relationships built on shared activities among its members. Much of the most promising archaeological work on housing and households has actually centered on Iron Age and Greco-Roman sites outside the subcontinent. What is most significant about this body of work is that despite the wealth of written data, archaeologists have actually chosen to focus on the archaeology. They already have written evidence, but they chose to focus on the archaeology and in fact found that this information provides a different picture from that which could be reconstructed from the texts. In the context of the Bronze Age, much less work has been done, and the focus had actually remained on the spatial construct of the house. In the case of the Greco-Roman world, many of the excavations were undertaken actually much earlier in the 20s and the 30s, and what we are now seeing in the literature are actually new interpretations of households by recontextualizing excavated artifacts within houses. Also, new excavations in many cases are aimed at recovering data in such a way as to recover household information, among other things. Thus, much of the work using new techniques of micro-artifactual analyses have been able to recover fine-grained information on the usage of spaces within domestic structures. The Mesopotamian Bronze Age is similar to the Greco-Roman world in the availability of writing as a source of data. Gelb uses the written record to investigate the term household in the context of social groupings, ranging in size, he says, from a small family household living under one roof to a large socioeconomic unit, which may consist of owners and/or managers, labor force, domestic animals, residential buildings, shelters for the labor force, storage bins, animal pens, as well as fields, orchards, pastures, and forests. Further, he has divided households into familial and public categories. What is interesting in his conceptual reading of the term household is a co-occurrence of categories that are material, such as fields, pens, storage structures, and social, such as owners, managers, or labor. Thus, if we were to use this reading, we would actually have to look at the spatial and material context, as well as the individuals in the communities that used and occupied these spaces and structures. Mesopotamian Bronze Age archaeology actually found it easy to focus first on houses and then move to other issues. Henriksen, quoting one of the original excavators, found that there was a commonly found house plan, which is called the fully flanked main room type. This is the type of plan where there is a central room or court surrounded by smaller rooms. This plan was called a single suite one if it occurred once within a structure, and if there were two, that is two courtyards surrounded by houses, then it was called as a double suite one. The former was taken to mean occupation by a nuclear family, and the latter with multiple courtyards was taken to imply multiple related family units occupying a single structure, in other words, an extended family or a lineage unit. Similarly, even if somewhat simplistically, wealth of households was considered in terms of large as opposed to small single suite houses. Both large and small single suite houses were found at several sites in Mesopotamia. She also attempted a classification of houses and let's say the rooms within houses into three types: front rooms, center rooms, and back rooms. Front rooms were either entrance rooms or those which entered or those which could be accessed from the entrance room. Center rooms gave access to at least two and sometimes other rooms, and they would have more than one doorway. Back rooms were isolated entities not connected with the entrance room, usually located at the back of the house, and could have more than one doorway. She also used the terms outside room and inside room, where the former had at least one of its walls as an outer wall of the house. The most household studies have actually had necessarily to concentrate or at least look at the contextual study of artifacts within rooms. Ideally, it would be great if we could actually get information on what are the kinds of artifacts that one is finding within rooms, on floors even more ideally. But in many cases, we don't get this kind of information because rarely in archaeology are we actually getting a mirror image of the past. Many of these, what we can understand as assumptions did not seem to hold. For example, one would assume that valuables would be kept in back rooms or rooms which are isolated. But what she found is that valuables were not necessarily only found in the back rooms, which were better protected, but could be found in front rooms also. Similarly, even though cooking was normally located in one particular area, it's not necessary that eating was also similarly restricted to that particular area. Eating could actually take place in varying rooms. So what she found actually is that back and central rooms served as multipurpose areas where food was served and eaten and where the inhabitants slept. Cooking was done in front rooms and long-term storage took place in back rooms. Intra-house burials were also in back rooms. This is of course not the case in the Harappan, where we do not have burials within houses, but it was the case in Mesopotamia. Water-related facilities are an interesting angle to the data from Mesopotamia, where unlike the Harappan case, they are far more sort of restricted, far more rare, and it is unlike the Harappan case where we have practically finds of water-related facilities in every house. Within houses, layouts and locations of doors could well illustrate the relative accessibility of rooms in relation to each other and to some extent the social relationships of those using a spatially defined entity. This Robert Blanton had actually showed much earlier that houses with rooms could be mapped graphically into tree-like diagrams indicating the degree of access between rooms of a house. A method to investigate relationships between inhabitants of specific houses and across neighborhoods could be done by plotting the distribution of artifacts considered charged with social and cultural significance. An exercise of this sort, for example, which was conducted with seals considered to be important identity markers, showed little of the clustering that would be expected with, for example, patrilocal residents with close co-residence of fathers and sons. Similarly, Banning showed that one way to understand the layout of houses was to see how they related spatially to each other and in turn neighbors to each other. Houses which were separate and possibly isolated could be distinguished from houses that had their entrances overlooking a common open area, and the latter suggesting greater social interactions among themselves. One of the major problems of Bronze Age household archaeology is, and it's very much the case like even now, that we tend to, when we sweep our houses out, we tend to actually remove the garbage, which is actually the subject matter of archaeologists. So in the Bronze Age too, inhabitants regularly swept their houses clean. This resulted in actually the lack of much primary information within houses, discarded material usually getting deposited in secondary locations. Only in cases with sudden abandonment such as disasters, fires, or earthquakes can archaeologists actually hope to get primary deposits. Despite these problems, there are new techniques where scholars are actually trying to look at analyses, that is looking at artifacts which are smaller than something like less than half a centimeter, micro artifacts which get embedded within floors, and then one can actually ascertain, because these are more likely to remain where they were originally deposited. These kinds of technologies can actually obviously only be utilized at sites which are currently being excavated, but and obviously cannot be the case for sites which were excavated in the 20s and the 30s, but could be with many of the currently excavated sites in the subcontinent. The second section is Mohenjodaro through the eyes of archaeologists. Mohenjodaro, located on the Indus, this site with the two mounds, enjoys a distinction of being perhaps the best preserved site of the Harappan civilization. It was excavated by John Marshall and Ernest Mackay, as well as several deputies. Both Marshall and Mackay had considerable experience of excavating in the Near East, and it is actually possible to see some of the ideas about Mohenjodaro may just have been influenced by what had already been recovered from various Mesopotamian sites. For the purposes of this paper, it's actually useful to begin with some of the problems in understanding, even in identifying houses at Mohenjodaro. Early excavators themselves highlighted some of these problems. One of these, as I have already mentioned, was this continuous rebuilding from phase to phase. In the same spot where there was a house, it would continue to be built again and again over that. This meant that older walls were rarely demolished, new ones used the older as foundations. So the excavators had to actually devise other ways of distinguishing constructions of different phases. Mackay wrote, "We were often able to decide the actual floor level from the footing on one or more sides of a room. Many of these footings were due to the economy. The masonry below them cannot be described as foundations because it is actually just the lower portions of thick walls." What they found, and what Mackay found, is that very often later masons, when using older walls as foundations, preferred to actually spread a layer of mud on top of the older wall, in some cases as much as 1.5 inches thick. And it is this layer of mud which actually served as a useful distinguishing marker between older and newer walls. Another useful indicator to figure out occupation levels within a structure was door sills and pavements. Now, as you know, when you enter a house, one enters through over the door sill, and what the early excavators did, that they knew the significance of these door sills, so they, in the process of excavation, they kept these door sills even while excavating further downward, so as to retain the working level of the house. And in those cases where doors were absent, and understanding of access and movement between rooms was actually, you couldn't figure out if there were no doors. In the case of pavements or flooring, these actually would have been excellent indicators of occupation levels, but sometimes we find brick floors were actually removed to serve the same purpose at a higher level. The drainage system was another way in which different areas of the lower town were actually connected. The system was useful because Mohenjodaro and many of the Harappan sites had actually a drainage system where each house had house drains, and these house drains connected with the civic drains, which is the drains at the level of the community or at the level of the settlement. So in order to see the connection between the house and the settlement, and these were rebuilt over time. So, the early part of Mohenjo-daro, the later part, so you could actually figure out the various construction levels of the settlement only because these drains connected from the house to the street drains. So it was apparent that actually working out the levels within each individual building and correlating it with the others in the vicinity and different areas with each other was some of the most challenging exercises in the archaeology of Mesopotamia, archaeology of Mohenjo-daro, given the fact that houses were probably rarely constructed or repaired at the same time. If we were to trace the common features of houses at Mohenjo-daro, what we find is sometimes a large, possibly unroofed room is found, which is often labeled as a courtyard. According to her, the courtyard is always in the northern or the central part of the house. From the western side of the courtyard, often from the southwest, is a staircase leading up either to the roof or to an upper story. Under the staircase, sometimes there is a tiny room interpreted as a privy. Staircases are always inside the house, not outside. Normally, to the west of the courtyard is a room which is accessed from the courtyard, which was identified by her as a kitchen. And this room and courtyard forms an important component of her yellow model. Now, Sarsina's yellow model is the most popular one. Out of 108 dwellings studied by her, 55.5% consist of various models, out of which 28 are yellow, 20 are red, 6 green, 4 brown, and 2 blue. A further 44 houses, or 40.74%, have supplementary structures attached to the model, which forms the largest part of the whole. She points out that the predominance of residential buildings composed of yellow and red models suggests that the private house at Mohenjo-daro conformed to a fixed pattern, which in most cases was represented by a yellow or a red model. Was there any kind of uniformity as to where entrances were from a particular direction? This does not seem to have been the case, as lanes and streets could front a house from any of the 4 directions. It's often said that entrances almost never led into courtyards directly, but that does not seem to have been the case, and there are examples to the contrary. Normally, houses had a single entrance, but there are cases, there are several entrances. Both Marshall and Mackay pointed out features of individual houses. Some of these features were paved areas. Some of these features were built-in furniture, for example, niches. Other built-in furniture would be things like jar stands for supporting storage jars. Other common features of houses were wells are normally inside houses, not outside, and if inside, are usually accessible from the outside. Now, if you actually look at the locality-wise details for wells within Mohenjo-daro, it's kind of interesting, and if you compare it between Mohenjo-daro and other sites. In an intra-site survey, this is a comparison that I did, you actually find that there are only 2 wells in an area of about 1.47 hectares from the Monir area, which is the extreme eastern part of Mohenjo-daro. And if you compare that with the HRA, which is 0.71 hectares, and there are 5 wells, but then look at the figure of 21 wells from an area of 1.67 hectares from HRB. If you actually look at an inter-settlement comparison, then it appears that on the basis of excavated wells, a figure of 700 wells has been estimated for Mohenjo-daro, and compare that with a similar estimation for wells at Harappa, and you find that there are only 30 from Harappa, which may have been over the entire settlement, whereas Mohenjodaro may have actually had 700 wells. And one of the explanations made for this is Jonathan Mark Canoyers, and he says that Mohenjodaro had less winter rain and was further from the river and hence needed wells. But it actually makes for a very interesting comparison and a very interesting difference between the two sites. Water-related facilities include drains and pavements apart from wells. Every house accessed a street or lane from at least one of its walls in order to enable house drains to connect with street drains. Areas within a house where water was utilized or located were often paved. Pavements have actually been found in several houses, in many cases signifying bathing areas. And you can see in the foreground of this photograph from the 20s, there is a paved area. It's a bathing platform with bricks set on edge to prevent the water spilling into an adjacent area. And normally you find these bathing pavements, bathing platforms are skirted by these bricks. But the sole purpose of constructing pavements was not only for bathing areas. In some cases, almost entire buildings were paved. A social archaeology of Harappan housing. Were houses outward or inward looking? The general understanding of Harappan houses is that they were centered on a courtyard, which was often not directly accessed from the entrance. Thus, the courtyard is often perceived as a private space for the members of the household, with many of the quotidian activities taking place in this space. It is easy enough to visualize the role of courtyards in tropical and subtropical climates. Many activities, just like in the present day, involving water, cooking, food preparation, bathing, and so forth, may have actually been located in the courtyard. Thus, the courtyard seems to be a common feature of Bronze Age housing in West as well as South Asia. The inward-looking nature of Harappan houses has been suggested on the basis of this interior courtyard, which could not be accessed from the entrance, directly from the entrance, or could not be viewed from the entrance, as well as the blank, windowless outer walls. However, is this really a privacy issue? Such a perception may not be rooted in the South Asian context, where windows may not have been required in a house which obtained light and ventilation through an internal courtyard. Moreover, the issue of privacy seems meaningless in those cases where you have wells within houses which could be easily accessed from the outside. As part of the documentation of structures at Mohenjodaro, Janssen and his team at the Aachen Institute of Germany adapted Henriksen's terminology for rooms within Harappan houses. For them, rooms through which one entered were called entrance rooms. Most houses at Mohenjodaro were of the single entrance type. Rooms which had more than one door were called transit rooms. In this diagram, 1 is the entrance room, 2 are transit rooms, and 3, the transit rooms enabled access between different stages, and 3 are the terminal rooms which could only be accessed from a single door. The difference from Henriksen's formulation lay in the designation of terminal rooms having only a single door. This kind of terminology also thus depended on the spatial access theories of Henriksen, Blanton, and Hillier and Hansen to determine who could have used which spaces. Hillier and Hansen have actually pointed out that space is determined by two kinds of relations, the relations between the occupants and the relations between the occupants and the outsiders. The space within the boundary, the entrance, and the outside space are part of a system. The space within a boundary established a category associated with some kind of inhabitant. The boundary formed a control on that category and maintained its discreteness as a category. The world outside was the domain of potential strangers. The space outside the entrance constituted a potential interface between the inhabitant and the stranger, and the entrance was a means of establishing the identity of the inhabitant, but also a means of converting a stranger into a visitor. Hillier and Hansen gave importance to the entrance as a liminal space, but the other rooms of the house are significant for other reasons. Were the most isolated spaces those where valuables were stored? How many terminal rooms did houses have? Were terminal rooms small in size, suggesting their use as storage rooms? Were bathing platforms near the courtyards? Clearly, such spatial analyses will require close attention to individual house layouts as well as artifactual finds. Harappan houses have till very recently hardly been the focus of archaeologists, and thus their peopling has also been largely neglected. Does the archaeological data tell us anything about the nature of the households that inhabited these domestic spaces? Are the blocks then an example of neighborhoods in Harappan cities? On a larger level, Canoyer used the term walled neighborhoods for the different mounds at various sites. In an interesting discussion of second millennium Mesopotamia, Keith uses the available texts as well as the evidence from archaeology to discuss old Babylonian neighborhoods. These neighborhoods comprised houses, but also commercial properties, storage facilities, craft working areas, ruins, temples, temporary structures, as well as empty lots. They may also have been gardens and animal pens. The textual evidence sometimes usefully dovetails with the archaeological, where you find references to being forced to eat bought bread, and you find rooms where there are several bread ovens, much more than would be used by a single household. So perhaps they were public bakeries. These neighborhoods in Mesopotamia don't reveal any sectors that could be defined by occupation. She points out that neighborhoods tended to consist of a large house surrounded by several smaller buildings. In this context, we can actually note a recent reinterpretation of one block in the HR area of Mohenjodaro, where the existing plan at present shows it divided into several houses that over time may have fissioned into smaller units reflected in the smaller spatial units. This may be interesting to see if it'll actually be kind of interesting to see if the later levels of the site saw increasing fissioning of households. For this, we will need a strict chronological control on the changes in spatial arrangements over time. So it has long been understood that social aspects are relatively difficult to decipher purely through material remains. However, while the domestic space is easily retrieved through archaeological methods, moving to the next step of spatially locating domestic activities and the people who perform them is often not undertaken. In fact, this is really one of the areas of social archaeology that sorely need investigation. The relatively recent excavations at Dholavira are a case in point. Public spaces at Dholavira have provided actually valuable counterpoints to what was understood so far of Harappan spatial planning, but it is lamentable that the domestic architecture of the site was relatively neglected. It's only to be hoped that the current excavations at Rakhigadi will actually try to do this and undertake this much needed task. This paper is my preliminary effort in actually looking at excavated houses in the Harappan context, which were in themselves extremely complex, and to view the people who built and lived their lives in them. Thank you.